Every year, the United States government mails a check to Cuba. The amount, $4,085. It is payment for a lease signed in 1903. Cuba's government considers the lease illegal. They have refused to cash the checks since 1959. Some accounts suggest one check may have been cashed in the early chaos of the revolution, though this has never been definitively verified. Cuba has kept the remaining uncashed checks ever since. And yet, the United States has not left. This is the story of how America acquired its oldest overseas military base, still in operation today, on land that was never truly offered freely, and how a single explosion, that was almost certainly an accident, set the entire thing in motion. To understand Guantanamo Bay, you have to understand Cuba. Spain first claimed Cuba in 1492, when Christopher Columbus arrived on his first voyage and declared the island for the Spanish crown. For the next 4 centuries, Cuba was a colony, its resources extracted, its people controlled, its identity shaped entirely by a government 4,000 miles away in Madrid. By the late 1800s, Spain's empire was crumbling. Country after country across South and Central America had broken free. But Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish control, and Cubans were determined to change that. In 1895, Cuban revolutionaries launched a major uprising. Spain's response was to send General Valeriano Weyler, a man his own enemies nicknamed El Carnicero, the Butcher. Weyler's strategy was brutal and deliberate. He forced hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians, farmers, families, entire villages, into fortified concentration camps in the cities. He called them reconcentration zones. There was no adequate food, no medicine, no sanitation. Estimates suggest over 100,000 Cubans died in these camps from disease and starvation. American newspapers, led by William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, printed detailed, often sensationalized accounts of the atrocities. Some stories were exaggerated to sell papers. But the suffering was real, and American public opinion was shifting fast. In January 1898, President McKinley ordered the USS Maine, a powerful American battleship, into Havana Harbor. The official reason: to protect American citizens and interests in Cuba. The ship arrived on January 25th. 3 weeks later, at 9:40 in the evening on February 15th, 1898, the Maine exploded. The forward third of the ship was obliterated instantly. 266 American sailors were killed. Most of them were asleep. Nobody knew what caused the explosion. The investigation took weeks, but the newspapers didn't wait. Within hours, Hearst's journal had already decided Spain did it. The rallying cry spread across the country. "Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain!" McKinley tried to pursue diplomacy. Spain actually offered significant concessions, offering to end the reconcentration policy and consider Cuban autonomy. It wasn't enough. The public wanted war. Congress voted for it. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. Here is what we know now, that they didn't know then. In 1974, Admiral Hyman Rickover conducted a thorough investigation of the Maine disaster. Most modern investigations suggest an internal explosion was more likely, possibly caused by a coal bunker fire igniting the ship's own ammunition magazines. But the exact cause has never been definitively proven. A 1998 National Geographic investigation using computer modeling reached a similar conclusion. There is no strong evidence Spain was responsible. The war that followed, and everything it created, may have been triggered by an accident. And there is one more layer to this. The very reason the US Navy wanted Guantanamo Bay was to store coal for its warships. Coal logistics played a central role in both the strategy that led to war and the importance of the base the war created. The war that followed, and everything it created was triggered by an accident. The Spanish-American War lasted 10 weeks. Future Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. It did not feel that way to the people who fought it. 3,000 Americans died, 90% of them from infectious disease, not combat. Spanish casualties were far higher. Cuban and Filipino fighters, who had been resisting colonial rule for years, bore enormous losses. But militarily, the outcome was swift and decisive. On June 10, 1898, US Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay. It was the first American combat action in Cuba. Working alongside Cuban forces, they drove out the Spanish defenders within days. The US Navy destroyed Spain's Caribbean fleet on July 3rd. Santiago fell shortly after. Spain signed a ceasefire on August 12th, and on December 10th, 1898, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war. Spain surrendered Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba, after 400 years, was free. Except it wasn't. The United States military occupied Cuba while a new government was established. When Cuban leaders sat down to write their new constitution, their founding document, the US government made a demand: insert the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever American interests were threatened. And it required Cuba to lease or sell territory to the US for naval bases. Cuba's leaders objected. They had not fought for decades to simply replace a Spanish master with an American one. The US position was clear: no amendment, no withdrawal. The occupation would continue. Cuba accepted. They had no real choice. The Platt Amendment was written into the Cuban Constitution in 1901, inserted under the pressure of a foreign military occupation. On February 23, 1903, Cuba's first president, Tomás Estrada Palma, signed the Guantanamo lease. He had lived in the United States for years and held American citizenship before becoming Cuba's first president. The man who signed away Cuban land to America had, until recently, been American himself. 45 square miles of Cuban land. The original rent, $2,000 per year, paid in gold coins. After the United States left the gold standard, the 1934 treaty recalculated the amount to its equivalent value, $4,085. That figure has never been updated since. The lease could only be terminated if both the United States and Cuba agreed to end it, meaning the United States never had to leave, not unless it chose to. Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, became America's first permanent overseas naval base. It was officially described as a coaling station, a place to refuel warships. Early photographs show it was little more than rows of military tents. Nobody could have predicted what it would become. Over the following century, Guantanamo Bay served as a staging ground for American military operations across the Caribbean, a strategic base during both World Wars, and a refueling point that projected American naval power across the Atlantic. When Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, everything changed. Cuba's new government declared the lease illegal. They stopped cashing the American rent checks. In 1964, Castro cut off the water supply to the base entirely. The United States responded by building its own desalination plants and power generators. Guantanamo became fully self-sufficient, a piece of America embedded permanently in hostile Cuban territory. Then came September 11th, 2001. In the months that followed, US government lawyers were searching for a location to hold terrorism suspects, outside the reach of American courts, outside the protections of the US Constitution. They chose Guantanamo Bay. Officials believed it would place detainees outside the full reach of US courts, a position later challenged in the Supreme Court in cases like Rasool versus Bush and Boumediene versus Bush, which partially extended rights to detainees. The detention camp opened on January 11, 2002. At its peak, it held nearly 800 prisoners. As of today, around a dozen to 24 detainees remain. The base that began as a coaling station, acquired through an ultimatum given to a country that had just won its freedom, became one of the most controversial pieces of territory on Earth. Cuba still wants it back. The lease still has no expiration date, and every year, the United States still sends that check. Cuba still doesn't cash it.